Hello and welcome everyone. This is Minhaj, CEO of Cydia, which is an AI-enabled academic and industrial research company. And tonight we have data professor with us. It's been a long-awaited video that you have all been requesting. Before we go ahead and dive into our fantastic question line, I would like to let you know that for further conversations around the interview and topic and his work, you can join our Slack community. The podcast is also going to be available at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Welcome, Chanin. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me here. Very excited.
Must be quite late at the night. What time is it?
It's about 10:15 p.m.
Okay. Thank you so much for getting the time out to talk to us. Let me talk about how I actually got introduced to your channel about a year ago. And it's kind of funny what I noticed about your videos. And it wasn't about data science. One of the things that I noticed about your video is that we both share the same mic. I have a Blue Yeti, and probably you use the same one also. And the thing that I noticed is that you have this sound blocking, kind of thing on top of that.
Right? Yeah.
And that was the first thing I noticed in your videos and not your data science. And that's kind of funny, how I remember your channel. And I was just wondering, you have to tell me about where I can get that also, because I've been trying to find that out for quite some time now.
Right.
Did you make it yourself?
This thing, actually, I bought it from a online shop in Thailand.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's called Shopee. I mean, I could send over the link for you.
Sure, that'd be great. I've been looking for it, and it's kind of funny. The only thing that I remember your channel from is this mental association of this sound thing.
Awesome.
First of all, teach me how to pronounce your name. Actually, let me give it a shot. It's called Chanin Nantasenamat. Is it good?
Perfect. Yes, that's like 95, 99%.
Okay, first shot.
Yeah, you got it right the first time. That's very amazing.
It is. I don't know if it's the same language family, but Thai and Chinese are the same family, or what kind of language is that?
Actually, Thai it's based on Sanskrit language.
Okay, but I think that's the language that precedes Hindi in India also. And
I think so. Yeah.
But if that's true, I should have been able to understand some of that. But it's written in very different script. What script is that? Is that original Sanskrit script or?
Yeah, so it's modified.
Tell me about it. What do you mean modified?
Yeah, so actually, I'm not really into the language origins. So they share like common origins, and I believe like actually some words or some names are quite similar.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, like I noticed like the last name, like sometimes there's like SRI. It's also common in Thai as well.
Okay.
Yeah, like prefix or suffix of the name. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Your first video you published about a year ago, which was how did a biologist become a data scientist? It's a very interesting one. We're talking about your journey into data science, being a biologist. And I train a lot of medical doctors, psychology students in my workshops with art and everything else. And I've noticed something that it's very odd that people who come from medicine backgrounds and psychology and social sciences, there aren't many data sciences courses at the undergrad level or the graduate level. And that's very hard for them to actually switch to data science once they get into the field, or they want to do some advanced research that involves data. And it's almost kind of impossible, not always, but it's very hard to spoon feed them and the whole concept from statistics and to different tools and how to get to coding. What has your experience been as a professor, both on YouTube and in real life?
Yeah, so let's see. Perhaps like before beginning to answer the question, maybe about like my journey into data science. So like coming from a biology background, breaking into data science kind of happened by chance. Although they're quite related, because in biology we would generate a lot of data, and when we have like explosive amounts of data, the question is, how do we make sense of those data? And so based on that question, it kind of led me to become more curious into like, how can I make the most efficient use of the data at hand? And so like by serendipity, I went into a conference, and then in that conference, I met a newly graduate instructor who just graduated his PhD from the US. And at the time, it was back in 2004. Actually, the term data science was not yet popular or coined. So at the time, it was called data mining. And so I was acquainted to the field. And then after that, everything became history. And so I pretty much fell in love with data science, data mining, and so been doing it ever since. And as an instructor or professor in bioinformatics, as you mentioned, actually, data science has not really been integrated into our curriculum. We had like one undergraduate course in our bachelor's degree in medical technology, because I teach in the faculty of medical technology. And so we had like a course called data processing. And we had that course for the past like 10 years. And then only until recently, we're starting to have more courses into like biomedical informatics, as well as more programming courses, which we've just created. And so we're going to be launching that very soon. So undergraduate student in the medical technology program will be able to take programming courses. And so that will be a game changer for the new batch of students, because nowadays, as you will all know, that biology is pretty much exploding because there's more automation, there's more data. And so in order to keep up with those big data or omics era, we have to figure out ways in order to efficiently handle and also make sense of the data. And so it's natural that we also need to learn coding, and we need to learn data science.
Very interesting. I was just wondering, you had this natural inclinity towards learning data science and using computational power to explore what can be done in terms of drug development and the data identification. We had Joshua Sarmer earlier on the show, and he also did a lot of work with drug discovery in biotechnology. And I was just wondering, if it's easy for you, doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy for everyone else also, especially with the language. So what were some of the personal challenges that you faced coming from a biology background in learning programming? Because as far as I remember, when you choose in high school in Pakistan, India, or other colonial countries, in high school you have to choose. You have to either take biology or math. So it's kind of either or choice. So once you have taken biology, the rest of their life, you're going to be, working with that specific subject. And that kind of leaves out a lot of room in learning the other subject. For example, if you're a medical student, mathematics is almost out of your expertise. And at some point when you are into biotechnology or drug development, then all of a sudden you realize that that's what you needed also. Is that same in Thailand, or what have your personal experiences been in learning a subject that you almost had forgotten from high school?
Right. Okay. So first of all, like actually most of my childhood education was based in the US. So I grew up in the US and I pretty much studied ever since kindergarten, preschool, kindergarten, middle school, and then high school in the US. And actually, when I was in the 10th grade, I took the high school equivalency examination. And then, so I pretty much skipped 11th and 12th grade. And then I got it's called the California High School Proficiency Examination. And so that's like the equivalence of a high school diploma. And so I came back to Thailand after completing 10th grade and having this high school equivalent diploma. And so I embarked onto my journey to pursuing a biology undergraduate degree. And so back then, I think it was in the 4th year, I wanted to switch major to computer science, but then I figured out like it's already pretty too late. I mean, it's like 4th year, and if I want to shift to computer science, I would have to start over again. And so I figured that it would be wiser to just complete the bachelor's degree in biology. And then at the time there was an opportunity for a scholarship for pursuing medical technology, PhD. And so I thought it was a great idea, and I was intrigued by this documentary I saw. It was like engineering an ear onto the back of a mouse. And so, I mean, that's like tissue engineering, right? And so that pretty much drew me into PhD study. Although upon entering the PhD study, I wasn't involved in tissue engineering, but instead I was involved in protein engineering. And so protein engineering would, like the project that I was doing was to modify the structure of the green fluorescent protein in order to like modify the amino acid in order to allow it to have like the color change, as well as to engineer a metal binding peptide onto the GFP or the green fluorescent protein so that it will be a biosensor, meaning that it will be able to bind to metal ions, and then upon binding, it will give off this signal so that we know that there's a metal contamination in the environment. And so based on that work, I presented my work at a conference. And so I met the researcher that I've mentioned, who just newly graduated from his PhD degree in data mining. And so I was able to then apply data mining to predict the colors of the GFP protein. And then I've also ventured into computational drug discovery, building models in order to predict the drug bioactivity, and been doing that ever since. So it was almost maybe 19 years since that date until this very day. No, actually, 2004. 2021. Yeah, so it's 17 years since that day. Yeah, so I've been doing data mining for I think maybe 17 years now. Yeah, so time really flies, and yeah,
it does. I'm going to have to ask you about the biggest challenge in terms of learning and the tools. But I think your video is shaking when you're leaning on the table.
oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So the question is, what do you find in your own teaching is the biggest challenge? Is it the statistical concepts that are hard to teach to students and the mathematics behind that, like correlation, regression, classification, use cases for that, putting that into code lines, how to interpret that, coefficients, things like this? Or do you think that it's the technical side of things that are harder for students to grasp? For example, installing RStudio and Jupyter notebooks. For me personally, I don't know why is that so, but it was quite a challenge to install Anaconda the first time, getting it to work, changing directories, and then installing different things into roots, and then kite and other lint fillers and things like this. What do you think is the basic challenge?
Okay. Yeah, so like statistical concepts or high-level overview of machine learning, I think that could be conveyed by lecture and also by demonstration. One of the biggest challenge I think would be the coding, learning to code, learning to program. And so like for those coming from a non-technical degree, I mean, just to grasp what is the concept of a variable or an array or data structure, data types. So that's a pretty much a difficult topic to teach to the non-technical students. Yeah, and of course, I mean, developing and installing all of the programs and getting it to work, or also like like installing libraries, and it might work in one version like R. I mean, there was an issue like if you it might work in one version, but then if you have another operating system, it might not work. Yeah, so there's some like some unexpected issues. So sometimes what worked on your own computer, but then when you arrive to the computer at the lecture room, it didn't work, and so it might require some tinkering until it worked. And so in order to overcome that, there was this website called rstudio.cloud. And so allowing the students to get access to that one pretty much saved a lot of time to getting it set up on various operating systems. So based on those difficulties, I would recommend to look into like cloud platforms or something that you know will work if you or make an image or a Docker container as such. Yeah.
I think many people's refuge from this chaos of tools in data science is to find intermediary softwares that are not syntactic and code based and not graphic user interface on the other side. You have made quite a lot of videos about different tools that you can use, like Vika and H2O and PyCaret. I actually had Vice President of Gartner on my show earlier, Doug Laney, and it was Gartner actually who coined the term citizen data scientists are the ones who are not very technically sound as engineers. On the other hand, they're not also pure social scientists or people who do not work with coding. And for them, these tools might be a good refuge, or let's say a middle path they could use to analyze their data. And I was just wondering, which tool do you think is the best, or the learning curve would be the shortest among all of them?
Right, that's a great question. So actually, I started off as, I mean, you could say I was starting out as a citizen data scientist. So as a biologist doing research. So my first exposure into data mining was using Weka. And so why Weka? Because Weka is very accessible. Back in the days, I tried to learn C programming. Actually, I made a video about that. And I mean, that effort failed like horribly. I tried Java and that also failed horribly. And then I tried Python. It worked. Yeah, it kind of clicked. And then when Python worked, learning R was a lot easier. And so I believe that, like getting the grasp of the concept, the technical concept is a big challenge. And actually it kind of clicked over the course of maybe like 5 years or so, like not consistently. Yeah, so like kind of like on and off, I tried to learn it and it didn't work. And then I like maybe 4 years later, I tried again. Yeah, so actually I learned Python programming after graduating PhD. During PhD, I tried to learn Java. During my undergraduate, I tried to learn C. And actually I learned and clicked on Python after I graduated PhD for about 2 years. So it's been 2009, I got my 2006, I got my PhD. 2008, I learned Python. Yeah, so yeah. What would be easy, I would recommend to, like, whatever you are able to understand, if you could break into data science, but just, like using point and click software, GUI based, I think that's more than enough. And there are plenty. There's Weka, there's Orange, there's Nime. So Nime is actually a good tool, and it's heavily used in for computational drug discovery. There's a lot of module that will allow you to perform like molecular descriptor calculation, and then you could connect all of the various node into a workflow in order to perform various analysis. And so, yeah, so whatever you're able to use to analyze your data, I would recommend to get a head start as soon as possible. And over the course of several years, you will slowly want to improve, and then you will grasp other related concepts as well. So actually, I think that it doesn't matter how you start. And so, like Kenji also has this awesome concept about like gradient descent. Like, I mean, you could start your journey of learning data science anywhere, and then over the course of several years, you have a
Minimizing the
tendency
losses.
to want to improve and learn. Yeah. So over the year, you will acquire more knowledge. You'll know more mathematics, statistics for machine learning, and you also acquire coding. So I think it all starts with the curiosity to learn, and then once that happens, and then you do it consistently. Yeah, awesome initiative also by Kenji, 66 days of data. And so, yeah, so there's nothing stopping you. You just need to start, and then everything will be history. So it'll be like a snowball effect. You will learn a little bit every day. Yeah.
It's a coincidence that you mentioned K9. I was talking to their director of education outreach about the software, and one of the problems seems to be that it's not very cheap, at least for the starting students. And then if you want to deploy that on AWS or Azure, then it scales up. But on the other hand, one of the interesting things you said about that you learn Python first, and then you moved on to R. And there's just,
Right.
I know, I'm going to open up Pandora box out there. There's a battlefield already between Python and R there. But
Yeah.
don't you think that but Python is a structure that's kind of more understandable? So it's kind of hard to move over to R instead. The other way around. For example, I learned R first and then moved on to Python. And it sounded a lot easier with Python structure. But on the other hand, Python indentation, it's very hard for a lot of people to grasp that. Why do we have to actually put parentheses in the right place? So what do you think is going to be the future, regardless of the fact that it's also domain specific? So if you want to have a general purpose language, Python probably is a little bit better, but academics is pretty much dominated by R.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, and I really think that it really depends on the field. And one of the most fundamental reasons for using R or Python, I would believe, is the availability of packages that would help your day-to-day job or work. Let's say that there's a package that will allow you to do a lot of tasks in a very short amount of time, instead of having to develop it yourself. If it's available in R, then I think you're more inclined to use R as well. Or if the library is available in Python, but then let's say that you want to use that library. Like, for example, I will use an example in my area of research. Like for Python, there's this library called RDKit. And if you're working into like cheminformatics, in order to describe like chemical structure, then you would like to use RDKit, and it's not available in R. So it's like one or the other. It's like, if you want to use that one, then you have to learn Python. Back in the days, like as I mentioned, I started using Python, but then there was this thing called Shiny. Shiny was introduced in R, and so that led me to want to learn and use R. And Shiny allowed me to create awesome web application. It's based on bootstrapping, and so it is mobile friendly, and it looks pretty great. And then one of the subscriber recommended Streamlit, and then that kind of led me back to Python. And then I'm like, wow, okay, Streamlit is very easy to develop. I mean, in just a few lines of code, you're able to generate this very, very powerful data application. And yeah, so I really think it really depends on the library. It's not like the language per se, not like learning for the sake of learning, but learning for the application of what the language will allow you to do. And so I think it's the features provided in Python or those provided in R. That would be the major driving force for myself in selecting a programming language. And so, as you can see, I'm very indecisive of which language I like more. So I would say I like both of them. I like both Python and R.
But there's a new recent development. I guess both Python and R are now realizing the fact that how big both of them have become, and there are interfaces into other languages. For example, within RStudio, you can have the Python code imported,
Right.
and vice versa. I was just wondering, how do you see this development?
Yeah, I think that is that's a great feature to have and to allow those who prefer R or those who prefer Python to coexist together. And like Jupyter Notebook supports both Python and R, but then to a different degree, like or maybe Google Colab predominantly supports Python natively, but then there are hacks that will allow you to use it in R. And actually, I made some videos about that, like how you could use R on Google Colab. And aside from Python and R, I mean, there's an upcoming language, Julia, and like Richard from Richard on Data, he has some awesome videos about Julia for data science. And so there are pretty cool libraries as well. Like there is a machine learning library called Flux for Julia, Flux, and then there's a port of scikit-learn in Julia as well. So they kind of ported into the Julia language.
Well,
So maybe,
it's been predicted that Julia is probably going to be the future, and I'm just wondering, have you had a chance to play with that, and do you see the potential there?
Right. I've actually had some plans to start using Julia, so maybe I have to come back to you on an answer for that. Yeah. I also see some potential of it, and I'm also planning to maybe make some tutorial videos about that. Yeah. So I'm planning to learn it as well. Yeah.
Let's take a detour and talk to you about your journey, not in terms of tools and the subject-specific learning, but by your own like personal life. Have you always been curious as a child about things, about data? Were you good at mathematics, or is that something that you developed during your studies and then stick to that?
Yeah. So I've always been fond of science. So it was not really data, but I think it's a curiosity to learn about the world around us. And actually, as a kid, I participated in this science Olympiad. In school, I took part in this rocket building contest where you take like a rocket bottle, like a bottle, like a water bottle, and then you would add high pressure water to it, and then you have to design a parachute at the top of the bottle. And so the rocket bottle that is able to hang in the air for the most amount of time, well, the team will win. And so we took part in that, and we got like sixth place in the competition. And I also took part in this like tower building contest. So it's like science Olympiad, and then we were able to take part in the states final. So competing at the national level in the whole of California. But then unfortunately we lost there. So we didn't make it to the nationals. Yeah. So we were only at the state finals. And so actually that gave me a good exposure to the like the wonders of science and the ambiance of participating in science competitions. It kind of gives this adrenaline pumping, learning and also applying and competing, and it's pretty fun as well. And also aside from that, I also like to play basketball. So it kind of have a same like a similar sense of like a competition, like game, like so we have to prepare so that we can like take on challenges, and so that was pretty fun for me. And aside from that, I was pretty much into Bill Nye the Science Guy. I'm not sure if you're also watching that one as well. So Bill Nye, he has this awesome TV show where he would have like he would cover various concepts in science in a fun way. And so after school every day, I would watch Bill Nye the Science Guy. And actually, I created this channel. Like my daughter suggested that I should create like a channel. Why don't I create a channel? And actually, I was going to name the channel The Data Guy, but then at the time, that name was already taken somewhere. And so, because I'm in academia and I'm working as a professor, and so and then the second choice was Data Professor, because my name is very long, like Chanin Nantasenamat. Like who would be able to remember that long name, right? So Data Professor became an easier to remember choice. Yeah.
Interesting. You talked about the machine learning algorithms that you mostly use in your work, and some of them happen to be linear regression and decision trees, support vector machine, and artificial neural networks. And I was just wondering, do you say that these have been most helpful, or do you think that they're in general they're the most efficient one regardless of the use case?
You mean like which algorithms are the most useful?
You think it's useful in your specific line of work, or do you think these are generally the best ones?
Oh, right. So so generally, like they're the traditional now, right? Because of deep learning. So they're like the traditional machine learning algorithms. I would say they're very useful for biology, and deep learning is becoming a new player on the block, transformer as well. As you may know of the AlphaFold 2, which pretty much was able to predict the protein structure to a level of accuracy similar to the experimental assay. And so, so support vector machine, random forest, extreme gradient boosting tree, they're all useful, but then to a biologist or chemist, they don't really, they don't really care about the technology. They don't really care about that. Like, what do they care is how are they able to use that to drive insights into the understanding, which feature are important. And so actually, I mean, one of the best algorithms to use would be multiple linear regression. It's very easy to understand. Whenever, like for example, if I teach an undergraduate course in machine learning or data science, by saying like, okay, you have this simple linear regression, y equals to mx plus b, all the students are able to understand that instantaneously, and then like explaining like the x, the m, or the coefficients and the magnitude of the coefficient with regards to the importance of the feature, they're able to understand that. So for a biologist or chemist, I would say that like a simple linear regression is a great algorithm to use. And aside from that is the principal component analysis as well. Yeah, so that is also very nice.
Josh made some really interesting videos about drugs dosages and the efficacy of the drugs. And I was just wondering, in social sciences, where I come from, there is a lot of difference in outcomes based on interaction also. And I know for a fact that it happens in drugs also, at least in terms of its efficacy, that some of those drugs might interact, or the components within the drugs interact with each other and might not yield the results that are optimal or at least expected. And I'm just wondering, multiple regression does not actually account for these interactions. So what are some of the tools that you use to ensure that these unintended consequences aren't a result of using simplified techniques like multiple regression? On the other hand, if you use complicated tools like artificial neural networks, then we have a huge problem to answer for, which is the black box. These models are not very interpretable, and drug development is probably the last field where you would want to use such models which are not interpretable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a very great question. Yeah, so first off, actually, my research team, our research lab, we've written an article, a book chapter about this very topic. The topic of the book chapter was towards the revival of interpretable QSAR models. So QSAR is standing for quantitative structure activity relationship. And so what we do is we apply machine learning to predict the biological activity of compounds with respect to the chemical structure. So meaning that if the chemical structure will change, then they are able to have biological activity change as well. And so back in the days, people were using linear regression and molecular descriptor to explain the properties of molecule. And with the introduction with more high throughput data, with more heterogeneous data, like before, I mean, a typical data set would be comprising of 20 to 30 compounds. And so a linear regression would suffice. But then when there's bigger data and the data becomes more heterogeneous, then there's introduction of other machine learning algorithms, like to handle like high dimensional data, like PCA, principal component analysis, would be a good choice to reduce the dimension and also to explain the contribution of each feature to the model. With the introduction of like deep learning artificial neural network, they're able to predict or model the biological activity very accurately. But then the question is, the thing is, it requires large amounts of data. But then in biology, like to perform just a few experiments costs a lot of money. And in order to generate that massive amounts of data, it has to come from industry. So like academia labs were a lot much poorer than the industry. Like the big pharma company, they have big budgets for that. Yeah, so us coming from academia, so we're limited to like smaller data set, and so like more simple tools will work in that respect. And there's actually a paper published that benchmarks deep learning and also like traditional like random forest algorithm. And so they saw that deep learning provided like marginal improvement, like less than 1%. And so if one would have to decide whether to use deep learning or random forest, I mean, less than 1% improvement would not justify the usage of deep learning. But then in recent years, when there's more and more data becoming available, I mean, that's becoming a different landscape. So there's a propensity moving toward direction of deep learning and transformer as well. Yeah. So
I mean, someone who's very naive to the idea, it's very hard to believe that FDA or other regulatory bodies would simply accept the results of studies based on simplistic models like multiple regression or linear regression. Because as far as I know, and I think you mentioned that in one of your papers that I was reading, that it costs a lot to make drugs. It is almost a process of 8 to 10 years. 90% of them do not even go to market or go to clinical trials. And then by 2015 already, it was an industry worth $60 billion or more. And I was just wondering, if that's true, and I'm glad actually I have you. I've been asking this question to a lot of people, and there's a huge rift on both sides that if it takes 8 to 10 years to develop a drug and 90% failure rate, how do we actually have COVID-19 vaccine out there in like what, less than a year? And people are being vaccinated. How did they even get approval, and do we even have enough confidence in is going to work or not? There have been people who have noticed the adverse effects of that also.
Right.
And companies, especially social media people, they are deplatforming people for raising concerns that it might be something you should look twice into. I'm just wondering, where do you stand on that?
Right. So yeah, that's a great question. So the thing is like this, like even in Thailand, I'm sure that there's also similar regulation as well. Like a lot of the major granting agency are shifting their focus toward providing funding for research related to COVID. And like in Thailand, there's several rounds of grants or fundings that are available if you're doing research about like either therapeutic development or vaccine development, or also other like social aspect of COVID-19. And so there's more research funding for COVID research. And so, and also like even in academia, if you are publishing about COVID-19, some journals will be able to waive publication fees for you. Major publishers are also making, like they have this thing called paywall. So you have to pay, readers will have to pay to have access to the research article. And so they made it free for everyone to read. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of funding available that allows rapid developments pertaining to new vaccines for COVID. And aside from developing a new drug, there's this thing called the drug repurposing or repositioning as well, whereby you're taking an existing FDA-approved drug and then you're finding a novel indication. Like for example, HIV drugs have been experimentally determined that they're able to also act as a therapeutic agent against COVID-19 as well. And so it's kind of like you're teaching an old drug a new trick. So like typically in research in drug discovery, it's impossible to test or evaluate whether a drug is able to bind to all possible drug target. So researchers will test against like one drug target or two drug targets, but then in reality, it could have an effect against another target, which they have never tested before. Like for example, a drug against cancer may be able to cure antifungal disease, or antifungal disease will be able to cure cancer. And the reason is because the structure of the proteins related to cancer and fungal disease have or share similar protein structure. And therefore, because of the similarity, what is able to treat fungal disease will be able to treat cancer disease as well. And so it's kind of like finding similarity and then repurposing the drug.
Yeah. I think it's a fair enough point that if you put more funding into drug development, it might speed up the process. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, the question is that if you're repurposing a drug, or even if you've created a new drug, you still have to do clinical trials, and by the nature of COVID-19 as global dispersion, mm-hmm. it's very hard to actually do that so fast, where vaccines weren't even available for clinical trials in all parts of the world. So what if there are different demographics that are causing the efficacy in drugs? For example, people in China might not respond to the drug that they've developed in US, or the one that they've developed in Germany might not work in Africa. What are the most a vulnerable population? Are the children, are the women, or are the older people? Are there any ethnic overrepresentation, like African Americans or Asians or Americans or Europeans? It's a very complicated question, and don't you think
Exactly.
it's a little early to experimentally roll out a vaccine? I mean, I don't see an alternative either. I mean, in Pakistan at least you have a choice there. You have a vaccine, you can either take it or not. I was just wondering, have you already had your shot, or where do you stand on that? And then on top of that,
Right.
how can we address those methodological issues in clinical trials?
Right. So actually, it hasn't arrived to where I am living, so
Okay.
we're still waiting for that. And as
Are
you
you going to
said,
get
it's a
one?
very right.
Are you going to get one?
Yeah. So if it becomes available, then
Okay.
we'll have to see. Like do our due diligence. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question, and there's no one size fits all. And so, like, what works for one population might not work for another, and so that requires a lot of studies. It's true that if you have an existing drug that have been tested, it will be faster and easier to have it used, like repurposed for another treatment. Um, but then there are side effects that can happen. Like a drug will not only bind to the target protein, but it could also bind to off-target protein as well. And because of that, it causes side effects to the patient. Yeah. So actually, vaccines and therapeutic drugs are they're quite different in the way that the majority of vaccines, like in the past, is based upon giving like viral proteins or viral fragments, and that will trigger the immune response. But then on the other hand, drugs will be able to bind and inhibit or modulate the activity, preventing it from functioning of the viral protein, target protein, or it could be antimicrobial or anti-cancer related. Yeah. So in that respect, there's a lot of research that will be required to evaluate whether a potential viral fragment will be able to serve as a vaccine. And so, yeah, so they're pretty much similar, but quite distinct in itself. And like for the most part, I'm more into the drug discovery aspect. With respect to vaccine development, that's actually a whole new area, uh, a distinct but related field.
What is the paper that you've written you're most proud of?
Most proud of, right? I think it hasn't been written.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're proud of
So
nothing?
actually, I'm proud of all. But then there's another paper that has not been written yet. But I think I would be proud of it, but it's something for the future. So yeah, so it's kind of like an unwritten chapter.
Okay.
It's kind of like you're looking forward to that. It's like you have that mental picture that okay, one day you're gonna publish that paper, but it's not yet released. So it's like in my imagination right now.
In your
But if
mind.
I have
Okay.
to select from the existing paper, I would say there's a paper called the Map. Yeah, it's my first review article. It's called A Practical Overview of Quantitative Structure Activity Relationship. And so that
Mhm.
paper was written back in 2009, where like I pretty much summarized like the field of quantitative structure activity relationship, how machine learning is used for drug discovery. And so that was written when I was like a new PhD graduate, and it allows me to kind of like take a step back and also do due diligence in the field of drug discovery and read more and try to synthesize like a small niche that I will be working in back then, and that I'm currently working in as of today as well. So I think that review article pretty much defined my research career. And so it kind of laid out the blueprints of the field for me, and it allows me to like take a look at the field in a high level, like an eagle, like looking down and seeing the potential areas or the gaps in knowledge that we could potentially identify and carve a niche for ourselves. Yeah, like my PhD advisor would always say, when you graduate your PhD, like it would be optimal if you could have like a niche area that people will know you for, or that you are able to specialize in, because he said kind of like it's impossible to know everything. And so if you have a niche area that you could do very well, then that would be super cool. Yeah. So my field was pretty much like machine learning with respect to computational drug discovery. So it's kind of like digging a small hole and then going deep, taking a deep dive.
Yeah, I don't think it's even possible by the nature of sciences itself to be able to do broad studies anymore. So you have to find your niche, and we're going to be talking about some of your papers on the show also. But let's get into something else. This last year has told us that despite our advancements in AI and technology and research, there's a lot to be desired, and there's so many things that we're not prepared for. One of the books that you talk about is Kei-Fu Lee's book, AI, China's Silicon Valley and the New World Order. A fascinating read, at least for me. And I was just wondering, what's the future of AI in bioengineering, given the fact that we have totally botched up the COVID-19 situation? We're totally unprepared for that. Given the fact that it's the same country where virus seems to have originated, where AlphaGo was watched by 250 million Chinese people when DeepMind actually first played with the world champion. And if that's the level of preparedness that we have for unforeseeable circumstances, can we predict future for any with any certainty at all? There's consistent struggle between U.S. and China in terms of different aspects of AI leadership, and in some aspects U.S. lead, and in others China is probably taking over. But what does it mean for bioengineering and future of medical technology?
Yeah. So super great question. So there's another related area, the Internet of Things. So that is also one of the major drivers, I think, for the future as well. And so everything now is connected to the internet. Even medical devices are also going online. And so all of these devices will be generating massive amounts of data. Even devices in the home, like Amazon Echo or Alexa. So all of these devices will collect data, and they're available. And there's this thing called the edge computing, whereby AI is applied at the source of the data generation. And so with relation to the field of medical technology or biomedical engineering, I would believe that AI and big data will play an ever increasing importance. What has in the prior century has occurred, I think that it will become much more clearer, in the sense, like, for example, there's this thing called precision medicine, where we're making use of the unique information of an individual, because the thing is 99.9% of our human genome are quite similar. And in fact, there's only like 0.001%, that's different. And so the difference of just 0.001% will lead to a lot of diseases that is different among people of different countries. It is because of the genetic makeup, which leads to different protein structure, and therefore what drugs might work for certain groups of people could also cause side effects and might not work for other groups of people because of the genetic mutations, or we could call it the polymorphism, not the mutation, but the polymorphism. So protein structure will look pretty much the same, but then there will be like some slight replacement, like the genetic codon, like the genetic the nucleotides will have a different codon, and therefore there will be a different amino acid. So structures will look similar, but will be slightly different, and so that will lead to like slightly different metabolism of drugs, and also like for example, some people could metabolize alcohol, some people cannot. It's because of the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. People who are lactose intolerant is because they're not able to metabolize lactose sugar. And so there are subtle differences, but also similarities between people. And so because of that, all of these data is very massive. There are more than 30,000 proteins in the human body. And the thing is, if we're able to map all of that in a digital manner, if we're able to harness all of those information, and also if we're able to create kind of like a digital copy of an organism, which we are attempting to, but not me, but other researchers are attempting to, I think that would be the future. Imagine being able to digitally create an organism that you're able to simulate, and let's say that you develop a drug, and then you could test it against this digital organism, and you can even bypass. Theoretically, you could bypass clinical trials, and then you try it on the digital organism, and if it works, then you actually do it on living organism. So I would envision that in the future, virtual cells, virtual organisms would be among one of the major players for the future. And there are some pretty futuristic video from a YouTube channel called I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Kurzgesagt. They have some pretty cool videos about like
it's a German one.
Yeah, exactly. Like a video about like, are we in a simulated world? So the thing is, maybe in the future we're able to simulate like entire society. I mean, if we're able to create a digital organism, we might be able to digitally simulate like big society as well, like a game, like in Second Life or Minecraft, but like self-autonomous. Yeah.
But I don't think the question is as simple, because we have had these techniques for such a long time. So we have this in vivo and in vitro experiments which you could run, isolating the cells and the DNA structures of new diseases and how drugs actually interact with that. And then 70% of the Nobel Prizes go to physiological experiments on animals, whose we have a continuity between ours and theirs in structures. And I was just wondering, there's a huge question of ethics when it comes to human experiments. That is exactly why it's so complicated to have a drug discovery process. And with this digital simulation, no one actually knows how drugs are actually going to interact with that, because it's a very closed system. For example, some of the futuristic experiments that actually overlap the ethical boundaries was reported in 2018 when a Chinese scientist named Zhang shocked the world when he announced that twin girls Lulu and Nana had been born with modified DNA to make them resistant to HIV, which he had managed using the gene editing tool and CRISPR-Cas9. Yes, and on one side, you have such transgressions in medical ethics. On the other side, we don't really understand how to take this research forward. And I was talking to the neuroscientist Boris Conrad earlier on my show, who does a lot of work and he's also a memory champion. He does a lot of work with MRIs, and this seems to be an existential question about. It seems like a dead end alley in terms of how do we take research forward. You cannot use human beings as animals like guinea pigs for the research. On the other hand, you have limitations of in vitro and in vivo experiments.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Yeah.
So
So
what do we do?
it's a complicated, topic that I think would require a lot more effort to further into. Yeah.
I think it's a very good point. Also, a good time to bring out the question of what is this CRISPR? I always had this curiosity on how does it actually work? Because what I understand is that our genome contains 2 copies of CCR5 gene, and people who carry both defective copies, the chances of them having HIV is quite high. And I was just wondering, if you genetically modify that, there is still 21% chances that you have a risk of dying early. So on one hand, you can do this experiment, but instead of that being useful, it can have unintended consequences. How does it actually work?
Yeah, actually, that is an area where I haven't really take a deep dive into, so I can't really answer that question.
Okay.
Right.
But that's really interesting. It's kind of
Mhm.
dangerous to think that human beings can go to this level where you could actually create or modify DNA
Exactly.
structures. And we have
Mhm.
had the history of I think it was in ancient Greek in Spartans where they would simply kill the children who weren't physically fit
Mhm.
to survive their tough lifestyles and to make sure that only the fittest survive.
Mhm.
And this this field is very sensitive to a lot of people. But
Exactly.
let's talk about some of the coincidences in
Mhm.
life. It's an enigma still to me that how there's so many cross paths in people who are meant to meet finally. Because I only found last year that Emmanuel Chanpetia, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, was working only 2 buildings away from me in Sweden in the same city at the
Oh,
same
cool.
time. And I also realized that we were also working quite close in Sweden by the time you were working in Uppsala. I was also living in Stockholm, working at
Oh, you were.
Ericsson. Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
cool.
I, I
Wow.
was studying for a master's here, and it was like 30 minutes only if I knew you were there. It would be really interesting. I was just wondering, what kind of work were you doing at Uppsala?
It was back in 2012, and at the time I was like a young instructor, just like 3 years after PhD. I met Professor Whitberg in Thailand. Like we were sending one of our PhD students over, and he happened to stop by Thailand, and so we invited him for a special lecture. And then after that, we got to discuss about science, about research, and then when he came back to Sweden, and then he emailed and then like provided some opportunities, like, okay, like there's this fellowship, would I be interested in applying? And so yeah, so that led to like a fellowship, and then that led to another a big research grant that we applied together, and then that led to another fellowship. So it pretty much initiated like um, like collaborations that we had. He's like a pioneer in the field called proteochemometric modeling. And at the time, I was only involved in like modeling compounds against a single target protein. But then he developed a technique where you could model several compounds against several target protein. And so it's kind of like leveling up the modeling that I've been doing against a single target protein to be able to model it against like several proteins at the same time. And so it was back in 2012 that I went there for about, I think it was like on and off, like I got like a 1-year fellowship. And so, yeah, back on and off Uppsala and Thailand. Yeah, and we also had this 3-year research grant. And then we co-organized in Thailand in 2016, the first international conference on pharmaceutical bioinformatics, where we brought like researchers from all over the world, from Kyoto University, from the UK, European Bioinformatics Institute, from Cambridge University, from over, I think it was like more than 40 countries, from Greek, from like several countries, China, yeah. And so it was an opportunity to network, yeah.
Sweden spends a lot of money in research when it comes to biotechnology and medical. I mean, partly because there's a huge aging population, and research in medicine is needed in some ways more than other places where population is younger, for example, in Asia or in Africa. But just tell me the kind of grants that you have. You seem to have a lot of grants that you've been working on it. And what was the major theme? Is it like drug discovery, or is it pharmaceutical technologies? What have you been working on?
Right. So most of them are involving like the development of bioinformatics tools. And so involving machine learning as applied to computational drug discovery. So that has been a common theme in my research and also in the research grants that I have applied to. And so, yeah, so it's a small niche that I'm in, like machine learning applied to computational drug discovery.
Okay, and I assume they would have some really nice labs. At least I did when I was studying there. What kind of machines were you using there? Were they already using Nvidia GPUs? I mean, you have made a video on Nvidia RTX that you received from Nvidia. I'm just wondering how do you actually use GPUs or TPUs in research in biomedicine? And did you have to parallelize a lot of GPUs, or what was the infrastructure for that?
Yeah, so in Sweden at the time that I was there, it was pretty much predominantly based on CPU, and so they have like a supercomputer. Yeah. So it was based on CPU, but now they have a lot of GPU facilities for that. I'm not sure if they have the new DGX one from Nvidia. Yeah, the smaller supercomputer one.
But when is that launched? I think that was after 2012, no?
Late last year or early this year. I can't remember exactly. Yeah.
But you were there 2012.
2012. Actually, I was there prior to Uppsala. I was in Lund, southern part of Sweden. It was
one of the best universities.
Study. Oh yeah, I think it was like in the top 100 or so. Yeah, and definitely a great place to study.
Yes, of course. It's such a nice atmosphere for intellectual exchange. I've been there a couple of times. What do you recommend as GPU for learning? Because that seems to, at least people ask this question a lot, what GPU would be good for CV tasks and other intensive tasks with a lot of huge data sets. And I was just wondering, on top of mind, if you can afford that, and probably Nvidia 3080 or 3090 is probably at the top of line. But other than that, what can you think? What has your experience been with RTX? Do you still use that?
Yeah, so I'm experimenting it with respect to performing molecular dynamics simulation. So it's kind of like trying to simulate how protein structure move in a simulated water box. So you're able to study about like the protein motion, and that will help you to better understand how you can modulate or inhibit the protein function by like putting a drug into the water box and seeing how does it really interact. And so based on the interaction, based on the flexibility, based on the rigidity of the protein structure, then that will help you to understand like how will you be able to, like find a way to prevent that protein from functioning. Yeah, so that's pretty much the usage that I've been using for the graphics card. But with respect to data science, I believe that Google Colab has some free GPU that you could make use of. And the great thing is that, it's for free. And so for college students starting out, obviously there's no big investment that you would have to make. Just sign up for Google and log into Google Colab, and you could harness some free GPU. But you have to select the option because at default it is a CPU. Yeah, so some free GPU computing to use.
But certainly you need probably a little bit more if you're competing with in Kaggle competitions, and there's certainly a limitation for number of hours that you can use that
right,
also.
exactly.
One of the things I do a lot, and I'm totally going to make fool out of myself in asking that, but as long as I learn, it's fine. How are drugs actually made? Is it from the herbs that we use in traditional medicine, or are they inorganic compounds? What do I eat when I eat a pill?
Yeah, so it varies. So some drugs are coming from proteins, some drugs are inorganic compounds, and also most of the drugs are like naturally derived drugs or nature-inspired drugs. So a lot of the
What's the
drugs that you
percentage?
see.
What's the percentage of naturally derived versus synthetic drugs?
I think that naturally derived drugs would account for a higher percentage. But then in recent years, there are more synthetic compounds being introduced. Like synthetic compound would be like, you cannot find it in nature. But most are either naturally derived, like you could just purify it from herbs, or you could take that structure from the herbs and then you modify it so that it has better potency, better, they call it the pharmacokinetic property, meaning like they have optimal ability to being able to absorb into the body, being able to distribute, being able to be metabolized by the liver enzyme, cytochrome P450, and other, like toxicological properties as well.
But you don't have a definitive number for a percentage.
Right. I'm sure there are definite numbers in some recent review articles. Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering, there's recently been a reversal towards integrative medicine and holistic medicine. And as someone who absolutely despises taking pills or going to hospitals, I normally, go back to herbs and chamomile tea and things like this to fix most of the things, unless you really have to. Of course, if you need a surgery or some kind of complicated procedure, you have to go to a hospital. And I'm just wondering if drugs are made of natural substances, why simply we cannot use herbs in their original form, or foods, because foods have the same compounds or ingredients that we use to make drugs. Why does it actually have to be in a form? Because we have a lot of traditional doctors. I'm sure you have some kind of Thai version of that, and then into Chinese and Greek medicine also. And we have our own Eastern version of that. It works pretty fine for a lot of people. So I'm just wondering, is it only our obstinacy in trusting the modernism and science, or basically just doing the same thing?
Yeah, so like traditional Chinese medicine or traditional herbal medicines in throughout the world, I'm sure there are. But then if you take a look under the hood, like at the molecular level, all drugs function by binding to the target proteins. So if you could envision abnormalities that you see, like the proper normal functioning in our body, there's over 30,000 proteins. And if you could categorize that into several different functions that they perform, like metabolizing energy production, breaking down food to make energy, physiological functions, delivering oxygen to various tissues in the body. So all of these are performed by proteins, and proteins interact with one another, and compounds are able to bind to proteins to activate or induce such thing called the signal transduction. So it's kind of like a domino effect, like compounds bind to protein and trigger some domino effects, and one protein binds to one protein, which also triggers another domino effect. And so all of these, if you think of it, it's kind of like an orchestrated manner, like a symphony. So they all interact in a distinct way, and in a diseased state, the interaction will be perturbed, and that could arise from many issues. Either it could be that there might be some mutations that might occur, there might be some exposure to pollutants that might damage particular DNA, and that could lead to protein change. The protein structure will change. So all of these, if you think of it as like if you think of it as a mechanic, if one small unit is not functional, it will lead to a domino effect. Like normally, we say that protein A will bind to B, and B, in order for B to work, A has to bind to B. But if A doesn't bind to B, then the downstream effect of that will not work. Yeah. So if you think of it in the grand scheme, they're all interconnected. And so slight changes will also lead to drastic consequences as well.
Yes, but then question remains: why cannot we, excuse me, use foods and herbs and vegetables instead of the pills that we make in labs and cost a lot of money? For example, what I know from psychiatry is that, if you're depressed and they give you SSRI, then for ADHD you've got Ritalin. What it does basically is that keep your homeostatis, where you do not lack the ideal stability from the norm. So for example, if you're too depressed, you take something that elevates your mood, and if you're hyperactive or you're too energetic, and it brings you down and to a normal level. And in borderline situation, then bipolar disorders, they're used a lot. And I think that has been the premise of traditional medicine for a long time. So if I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, there's an ancient there are 4 temperaments. It's sanguine, and phlegm, and then melancholic, and there's one other that I'm missing. Which one is that? Bucolic, I believe. No, maybe. So these are just 4 different temperaments, and ancient doctors would give people medicine and herbs that would bring a balance to their temperament so that they can function properly. And in a larger 20,000 feet view, if you look on the medicine, that's the whole purpose also, to make sure that patients get back to their normal position. And I was just wondering, how is drug discovery any different from what we have already known throughout history?
Right. So, that's a great question. So in modern drug discovery, it's based purely on compounds, typical structures, small molecules that are able to bind at the molecular level to target proteins. Let's say that, I've been doing some research about breast cancer drug development. There's this enzyme called aromatase, and they're responsible for converting androgen to estrogen. And so when there's a overproduction of estrogen, so the aromatase enzyme is the drug target, meaning that we want to inhibit the function of the enzyme. And if we're able to inhibit the function, then we will have a lowered production of estrogen, and therefore that will curb or inhibit the proliferation of breast tumor. The thing is, if the food contains bioactive compounds that resemble a drug that will be able to bind to the aromatase, if we are able to find such a food that contains the structure, then they could definitely be a therapeutic food. But the thing is, there might not be. And therefore, in order to discover that, scientists will have to perform this thing called the high throughput screening, meaning that they have like this large collection of compounds, and they will individually test this millions of compounds against one enzyme to see which of the million compounds will be able to bind and inhibit and lead to a phenotypic change, meaning a reduction of breast tumor. And therefore, if we're able to identify a structure, let's say that, okay, it's found in, let's say that curcumin, and it's found in turmeric, then we could also say, okay, maybe turmeric could be a preventive medicine for that as well. Yeah. And actually, there are several coming from food, and they're termed bioactive compounds. Yeah, so we have gingerol, we have coming from ginger, we have curcumin from turmeric, and there's several more. Resveratrol from wine, red wine, flavonoid. So these are also interesting classes of natural compounds.
It's very interesting that you talked about that, which one of those enzymes would, have the largest effect on the phenotype. I'm just wondering, it's kind of a feature engineering of sorts, where you find the best one that acts in an optimal manner. And I'm just wondering if you have a database for all these enzymes or other compounds, if you may, why don't we have the database for the foods through which we have extracted the enzyme, or are they found? And I'm not sure, and I'm totally being naive here. Do we really have kind of a food and those relationships between its ingredients? And then finally, once we feature engineer the best enzyme for the phenotype, we could also find out which food is that. And instead of prescribing the medicine, we just simply prescribe that food a little bit more.
That's a great question. I believe there are databases that provides a collection of all bioactive compounds and the sources of those. In fact, there's a database called Django and also PubChem, which houses a large collection of chemical libraries, and they do tell like what is the origin of the compound. Is it a synthetic compound? Is it a natural compound? And if it's a natural compound, then is it coming from which particular organism? It could be coming from herbs, or it could come from animals or reptile as well. Like there are some, like for example, anti-cancer peptide coming from snake or the skin of frogs. And so, yeah, it could come from all sorts of organisms, even marine organisms as well.
But I do understand that on the other side, if you take traditional medicine too seriously, we also have like snake oil sellers and charmers who would, simply fool you into buying anything. But don't you think on a broader, just for argumentation's sake, we should have departments in university where we study traditional medicine also? Because I mean, if that has been popular throughout the history, isn't there an element of truth that's worth exploring in those therapeutic techniques and the ancient wisdom that's in the books? Do you think that it would be helpful if we actually collected that information and did more research on traditional medicine as well?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And there are some research that's kind of like debunking like traditional myths. Like there are some studies using cheminformatics, like using machine learning, to learn about like how does the traditional Chinese medicine, how are they functioning? As you mentioned about the four temperaments. And so they're trying to link traditional Chinese medicine to systems biology to see like, okay, how do they superimpose onto one another? Like for one thing, okay, is it like just a folklore, or can we find biological proof that they do modulate the function? And there are several interesting studies, and they do try to correlate, like, okay, each of the temperaments into modulating a particular pathway of the biochemical metabolism. And so there are some interesting study into that area as well.
Yeah, for example, I think homeostatis is probably the modern version of saying the same thing, which is, a balance in the temperaments. So if I were to give you an example, because I've studied that for some time, just for fun, how it works.
Right.
So in some of the Asian medicine, you have three parts of your body that should work in tandem with each other. So for example, your brain, your heart, and your liver. And all three of them is kind of a triad. And in that triad, if there is an imbalance, so the color of your eyes and the color of urine and a lot of other symptoms that these ancient doctors actually check tells you where the problem lies. For example, if it's too white in the urine, it probably is an indication that you're in a lot of mental stress, which means that you should be eating foods like almond or walnuts and other things which would empower your brain. And I was just wondering if that resonates with you also, because we know for sure that some foods are good for some things. For example, you don't want to eat a really heavy lunch if you plan to run a marathon. And certainly fast food every day is not very good for your brain function also. But do you see the element of truth in that?
Yeah, it's definitely, but then I'm also not really a healthy, I don't really, I try to have a healthy diet. Yeah, but definitely if all of those are also contributing, let's see, you mentioned about one of the temperament as being the liver. And if we compare that to modern medicine, then it's equivalent to the cytochrome P450. So these are the liver enzymes. And the family of cytochrome P450 enzymes, there are like hundreds of proteins in that family. And so the challenge is, which of those protein family are they? They are the liver enzyme, but which of them are responsible for the disease or the abnormalities of the organ function that might be in the patient? And yes, food, if we take in a lot of junk food, right? So it will lead to our body having to function much more. If we have food that are pretty much like processed, baked, not baked, fried, then your body will function much more. I don't have the technical term for that. Yeah, so the thing is to keep the diet at a minimal, like in terms of processing it, like if you could boil it, but the thing is the vitamins might be degraded. Yeah, I think it's my line of thought is not fully functioning.
That's fair enough. We just kind of explorative
Yeah.
conversation of what is
Right.
possible. But let's also talk about, these conversations are very important to happen, even if we might not have the answers at the moment or even in the future.
Right.
But do you foster this conversation in schools? We talked about the need for teaching undergrads and graduate students R and Python, or at least give them some encouragement or tools to get started with the programming that would help them explore their fields. And one of the great things about data science is that, I don't know, for me at least, it's that it doesn't require you to come from a certain background, like computer sciences or physics or
Right.
Engineering. This is kind of a tool that everyone can use. It's kind of a means to an end. And I was just wondering, what is that fascinates you about data science?
Yeah, so the fascinating part about data science is making sense of data. I like the data visualization aspect of it, and lately I like the high of developing bioinformatic tools that other scientists could use in their own research. Like lately, we have been developing a lot of web application whereby users could just input the compound or the protein, and it will be able to make a prediction based on the model that we had developed using some machine learning algorithms. And aside from that, I think it's the data visualization and making sense of the data and finding the gaps in knowledge in order to drive more further experiments, which our collaborator could also do. And so I think it's about finding the missing gaps in knowledge in biology and the feeling of developing something that could cure disease, and also the implications and the impact that it will have. Yeah, so that is what driving most of the research that we're doing. Yeah, so it's a sense of satisfaction for that.
There's one problem with this whole development cycle of data science. When I was young, I used to make websites writing HTML.
Okay.
It was kind of the new thing there. So you have different tags, and you have to enclose your text within that, and then you can choose to bold it, just like Markdown now.
Right.
But then at some point, Adobe launched a software. It used to be called Dreamweaver, where you simply have to drag and drop pictures and
right.
create links and things like pretty much like Word software now. So you can simply do anything with the text by selecting
what you see is what you get type of tool, right?
Exactly. But that
I also use Dreamweaver as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Dreamweaver from Macromedia, right? Before Adobe bought it. Yeah.
Super cool
Awesome
software.
Tool.
But I'm just wondering, why is data science not treading the same path? Because at some point, it's 2021. People should be able to run their analysis using a graphical user interface. And we have something called R Commander in R, but it's not very intuitive. By now, you should have been able to manipulate with your data sets within the software without actually having huge delays, no matter how big the data set is, because you could use some kind of optimization for the rows and columns, and then the whole life cycle should have been kind of what you see, what you get. But it's still not there, and I'm just wondering, why does it have to be so slow? It excludes a lot of people. I do understand from my experience. Unfortunately, a lot of people are discouraged by the complications of doing coding in R and Python, and the sheer process of starting to install a software and reading documentation. People are not used to it, and I have I can totally get why they think that, especially if they're not coming from a mathematics background. Why do you think that we're still stuck on code lines?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I truly understand that, and I mean, myself coming from a non-technical background, I also started from using. There are tools for point and click, drag and drop. So they're more like workflow. So I had a couple of videos, like for example, Orange. It's a drag and drop. You could build a workflow for creating your machine learning model. Like for example, you could have a node for reading CSV data, and then you connect that node. When you read in the CSV data, it's comparable to reading it using pandas, and then you're assigning it into a data frame. And so with that node, you read in the CSV data, or it could be an Excel file, and then you create automatically a data frame. And then you could drag and then you could link that data frame that you have read from the file, and then you could use it to perform feature selection or feature engineering. And also you could then link it to create a machine learning model. After that, you could generate a plot, and then you could link it to a node that will save it as a file. And so you could actually create some awesome workflow using Orange. And there's another awesome tool called Nine. So both of them are pretty much like the what you see is what you get type of tool that you could build pretty complicated machine learning workflow as well. You could perform, I believe, all of the tasks that you would normally do manually in coding in Python. And so when you're coding in Python or in R, it feels pretty much like you're building a house, but then you also have to like manually, like brick by brick, right? And then you have to decide like what material, what type of brick you will use. And how will you lay the brick to build the house? And the thing is, it might not be an optimal way because when you're doing it manually. But then there are tools that are starting to be released. Recently, there's a tool, a web application using Streamlit. It allows you to create like a template. I think they call it the boiler maker. Was it boiler maker template, where you kind of like click like what you want in your machine learning workflow. Like for example, you want to import your data, you want to build a random forest model. Then you click on generate, and it will generate the code for you. So you don't have to repeatedly like, okay, import library, read in the data, split the data, build the model. So it's pretty, what do you call it? It's like repetitive. In my own workflow, I would create like a general template. Like for example, read in the necessary libraries, read in the CSV data, perform feature generation, feature engineering, and then perform model building, and then compare the performance of different model. So I would have like a general workflow, but then for each study that we do, we might need to do some tweaking. We might want to develop a new feature. We might want to hack some of the parts of the model building. Like for example, if your data is imbalanced, then you have to figure out how will you make the classes to be balanced. Otherwise, there will be like biases in your prediction. Yeah, so in our lab, we do create like a template, and then we modify the template. So that will allow us to work much faster. Yeah, but so I think it's a choice. Yeah, that you could choose to code it manually or to use an existing point and click software, or to generate your own template. But the thing is, people are reinventing the wheel over and over again. I think that's like one of the slow process that we're all doing.
I think Streamlit is still, a lot of code-based software. What I'm thinking is, feel free to steal my idea, and I hope someone actually does that. That in PyCharacter is quite close to what I would say is more. It resonates with citizen data scientists. For example, what you have to do is that you simply use their boilerplate template and paste that in Python, whatever IDE or Jupyter you're using, and then you can simply specify the arguments. So, for example, if you're using classification, you can choose different matrices that you want to put in, the kind of transforms you want to use for categorical data or nominal data or anything else. And you can also choose the imputation technique. So there's a lot of parameters that you could actually compute with that. Well, one of the things that I actually talked with the creator of PyCharacter, also Muiz. By the way, he's from Pakistan, also a very interesting guy.
Okay.
So they have their Slack community also, in time to time I'm contributing to that also. And I gave them this idea, but there are only like 3 people that probably don't have enough workforce that. But my idea was that, if you can actually give this option for people to individually specify the parameter for all the situations, then you can also make a checkbox for that. So why bother actually writing that at all? So just like classification model. So I want AUC and RSA curve and precision and all these things. And then with the regression model, I want this learning model. So you can checkbox the random forest or nearest neighbor and other things. So instead of making people do the work, tinker with the text, by the way, some of them would, from my personal experience, some people are very confused by the commas in between different parameters, or the parentheses, or the commas, like inverted commas also. So instead of giving them this room to make mistakes and confuse them, simply use checkboxes and create something out of that, because that's something you're already doing, and everything else is working on the back end, at least for the PyCharacter. And I'm just wondering, is that kind of an approach that you think would make it more easier for a lot of students?
Yeah, so PyCharacter is an amazing package, and I've done some tutorial videos about that as well. And actually, PyCharacter is a type of auto ML, automatic machine learning. And there are, in recent years, a lot of a lot of developments into this area, auto ML. From my own research group back in, I think, early 2000, in the late 2000, like before 2010, we published a book chapter and we developed this thing called AutoWika. So Wika is a point and click software. And so back at the time, it's like we're repeating the task of, like repeatedly opening the program, clicking on open file, select the input file, and then we would repeatedly perform feature selection, and then we would repeatedly modify the seed number. Like we would have to manually click it like 1,000 times if we were to build like a parameter optimization. And so what we did was we created like a macro where it will generate a file, and then it will automatically run off all of the potential parameter optimization. And then after that, we coded it in Python. Like several years later, we coded in Python, and then we used WX Python to create a GUI. So users can just input the data, click on run, and it will perform parameter optimization. And actually, we published one book chapter in Springer called AutoWika. And so, as you mentioned, instead of leaving room for making errors, that software allows us to streamline our prediction workflow to be much quicker. What we only need to do is prepare the input data, and then after that, everything downstream will be automatic because we're repeatedly doing the same thing. But the thing is like this, that the template might work in one scenario, but the thing is, if the data changes, if there's a drift, then we have to optimize the code. And so the template might be irrelevant. And so like, for example, it might require us to modify steps number 5 or steps number 8. And so if we're able to code it manually, then we could make the proper adjustment. Yeah, so the workflow might work for most of the cases, but it's not like a one size fits all. So it might not work for all cases as well. And there are there might be some patterns in the data in the future that might not be relevant to the model that was built 10 years ago, and therefore it needs to be updated. And therefore, if we're able to code it manually, then it will allow us to modify the workflow.
Apart from the data analysis side, that's a good segue now to get into data engineering aspect also, where you actually curate and generate and transform data, and that's where 60 or 70% of the time in the whole pipeline is spent. Right. And I was just wondering, what could we do to make it more seamless process? One of the things that you could do is, of course, create quality checks while collecting data, but that's not always in your hands in many situations, especially the industrial situations where companies give you data and then you have to fix it yourself because you don't have enough power to ask them to implement policies to make sure the data quality is good. And that leads us to the famous proverbial rule, which you have back on your wall also, like garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was just wondering, are there tools for data cleaning also at some point, like built-in thresholds where you could imputate according to rules? For example, 20% or more data is missing, just drop the column. If that's less than that, use some mean replacement and things like that. And that sure has to do a lot with the nature of the data also, so you can simply blindly apply imputations. Is there a way we can simplify that as well?
Yeah, so like what I would do is to manually perform it. Like sometimes I would prototype it manually by performing the analysis in a Microsoft Excel. And if it worked, then I'll code it in Python to automate the process. So do it manually, and then once that works, automate the process. And then use the script that we created either in R or Python for applying it on a new data set. And so that will allow us to automate and perform the analysis much quicker for the future. Unless the new data breaks the workflow, then we have to optimize the code again. And so in a loop, yeah. So as long as the data works, it's okay. if something happens to the data, patterns disrupt the current workflow, then we have to make adjustments.
Yeah, my company works a lot with these companies, which has the simple rule that we're talking about do not apply to them. So there's a whole data engineering team that does the data ingestion from external data sources and internal databases, websites, e-commerce stores, and that's a huge task. And then you have to connect that to some kind of central data warehouse and data lakes, and then on top of that you could use Databricks or other analysis frameworks. And I was just wondering if because at some point Excel are useless. You have to use PySpark or something else that does large scale data, especially if it's coming from NASA spaceship or Google or Facebook with an enormous amount of data. So what can we actually do to, I mean, that might not be your field in some way, but out of curiosity or just wild imagination, what could be some of the checks that we could use to make sure that we have good quality data in these large environments?
Yeah, so different data will require different steps for processing it. So that would predominantly based on the domain knowledge. So like data in biology, it would require a certain set of pre-processing to make it work, to have higher quality. Data in chemistry will need another set of instruction. Like for example, chemical data needs to be standardized, meaning like, for example, the chemical structure needs to be normalized. Like in a given chemical structure, there might be like several tautomers or a different isoform of the compound. And therefore we have to figure out like which one is applicable at a given pH, which one is applicable. And so that will require domain knowledge. And so I would imagine that data coming from industry or coming from other fields, social sciences, it will require specialized domain knowledge in order to make a decision like how to best handle, because there's not like a one size fits all. And so once we're able to figure out like, in this scenario, we do this. In this scenario, we do this. If we're able to do that, then we could automate that by writing a script to perform the analysis. Actually, that's what we're doing right now. Before, we used to perform the data curation manually, and that took us about half a year for one data set. And then we automated that using Python, and I'm hoping to publish that soon. Actually, we've developed it in the lab for personal use inside our own lab for the past 5 years. We're able to reduce 6 months worth of data curation into 5 seconds, no, 2 seconds. So upload the data and it will perform all of the pre-processing that we would normally do back in the days for like maybe 2 to 6 months. And we able to streamline that into 2 seconds. So upload the data, and within 2 seconds, you get the pre-processed curated data. And so that is based on our, like manually, repetitively, like for thousands or 10,000s of time doing it, like, thousands of time. And then one day we're kind of like, we got tired of doing it manually. And it's like, okay, let's do it automatically. And yeah, so started to learn Python and make it work.
Yeah, but I think the schema for data must have been similar in order to do that, because if you run cron jobs, that assumes that your schema of the database is the same. And I was just wondering, how would that translate to unstructured data, for example, NLP tasks, or some kind of SQL injection that screws up your data, anything. So what would you do in that situation?
Yeah, so actually we pretty much worked with structured data for the most part, tabular data. There is one project where we worked on analyzing literature data, like performing text mining. We did manually like create a dictionary of words, grouping them, performing manually. Back in the days, I think it was like 2009, we published a paper by analyzing literature about molecular imprinting. What we did was we developed like a sliding window. So the program was developed by a PhD student of mine. So he coded this in C language, C++, And so what he did was created a like, we call it like it will read and slide like a sliding window, and then it will also have like peripheral vision. It will look at a particular term and it will compare it with the output, the expected output. Is it correct? If not, then it will learn that, okay, this particular word and the environment, like 2 to 3 words upstream and downstream, what words are they? And if it's not so the thing is, we're trying to perform the task of named entity recognition. Like from a particular paper, we want to identify the compound name. And so, like for example, if it's reading the first word, the, and it will look at the left and on the right, what words are they? If the, then to the left, there's nothing. To the right, the molecule. Okay, and then the next word is molecule is, and then the fourth word will be the name of the compound.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, if we slide it in, and so the third word will be the name of the compound. And so if we have to slide it for the fourth time, then the compound will be at the center. And then what is to the left and what is to the right? So what we did was like manually, like a semi training machine, where the human, like the PhD student, what he did was manually trained word by word. So he created a program where the program will slide word by word, and then he will have to say whether that is the compound name. And if it is yes, then it will learn that, okay, this is the compound name, and to the left and to the right, what words are they? And then over time, over like maybe 50 iteration, it will start to make an educated guess that, okay, before the word is, and before the word molecule, okay, the fourth word will be the upstream to that will be, downstream to that will be the name of the compound. Yeah, so we did that like pretty much manually.
Have you used any NLP tools like Hugging Face or LTK or any transformer?
Yeah, okay. So it was coded in C, and no Python libraries were used. So that was back in 2009. Yeah.
One of the questions that I really wanted to ask you, because it's very nauseating, at least for me when I use write papers in RStudio, is Markdown. And the Latex in RStudio is so broken, with this native package. At least when I last tried that, it wasn't ready to, write papers in that with our code embedded in that. And, a lot of people would simply use Overleaf for the Latex formatting of their...
right, my favorite.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just wondering why RStudio is still not able to fix their... Markdown system in which they could embed the bibliography as simple as Overleaf. I mean, why is that so hard?
Right, I'm not sure. I think we have to contact the developer of that, right?
Oh,
so I think there's Knitter and there's R Markdown, right, for that. Yeah, I think the developer is at E. He has a Chinese name. Can't remember right now. Something starting with a Y.
They're very slow in answering for some reason. I've been talking to them about some of the capabilities of R, and simply don't reply. I mean, I don't think there are so many people available for communications with clients at R. But anyway, I would love for them to actually figure out this Latex thing, so people don't actually have to use external softwares. Now, let's get to some of the things that are most important for industrial clients. And also now it's becoming important for academic clients also, which is deployment of your apps. And that has been always a problem for, less technically savvy people. Now we have Streamlit and our shiny dashboards and everything else. But even with that, if you want to, if you want to scale your apps in AWS or Azure, or make it easily accessible for a lot of people across the globe, then that you actually have to have a separate DevOps guy, at least in bigger companies, for that. What are some of the things that we could use as citizen data scientists, or let's say the beginners, to be able to showcase your work, especially in research labs and PhD students, who are almost like slaves, with no pay, so they don't have money to pay other people to, showcase their work. So what would be the easiest way for them to deploy their apps?
Yeah, so I would say Streamlit if you're using Python. There are also other alternative as well, like Dash. It's from the creators of Plotly. And so those would be friendly for the citizen data scientist. For those more into coding, there's Flask and there's Django. For R is obviously R Shiny. So I would recommend Streamlit and Shiny, for the typical data scientist.
The process of it, for example, I made an app for my own research in our studio, and the process is not as straightforward as most people think. So you have to have a UI component, and you have to have a server component. Yes, and then you have to do a lot of tweaking in order to get this ready. I mean, one of the things that I really like about RStudio is that there are no additional configurations that you have to make. You simply have your data set ready, and then you configure the UI and server component, and just deploy the app, and it's going to be there in the cloud for everyone to actually reach without any cost. To mention that, but I was just wondering, it's not very scalable at some point. For example, if you have 1 million customers, or let's say other people who would just visit your app, what would be a better solution to scale it? And do you think Streamlit would be a better alternative to you actually convert that from R to Python and then deploy that to AWS? Or what do you think? Generally, what's your idea?
Yeah, so I would believe that both Shiny and Streamlit, they're on like equal level. So they're good for deploying a minimal viable, what do you call it? A minimal viable product, a minimum viable product, MVPs. So that will be allowing us to test the hypothesis. Like, okay, we have an idea and we want to develop like a quick application. So Streamlit and R Shiny will be able to do that. For those in academia where, okay, we might not have the facilities to afford like a big team to develop that, like a full stack. I would say Streamlit and R Shiny is the friendly platform for academia. If you're going more into software engineering, I would recommend to maybe chat with Forrest Knight. He's a software engineer, and he's collaborating with Kenji right now. Like Ken developed this leaderboard for his YouTube channel where he wanted to measure the engagement of his subscriber, like how many comments or how many likes the subscriber are making on his YouTube channel. And so he developed an initial version of the leaderboard in Streamlit, and now he's partnering up with Forrest Knight and Tina Huang, and they're using this MERN stack, MERN. And so I think it's MongoDB, and there's React and Node.js. Yeah, so I'm not really a software engineering guy, but that would be like scaling to much more sophisticated.
How is he doing that? Is it like a YouTube API where he could get the data, or is it just simply web scraping?
Yeah, so that requires the YouTube API. So anyone can apply for a YouTube API. And in order to make the request, you have to have a special like permission. And so under the hood on the server, you have to pull the data from the YouTube via the API. And then depending on the tech stack that you're using, if it's Streamlit, then you pull the data and then you have it in the form of like maybe like a JSON format, and then you could display it using pandas right inside Streamlit. But with the MERN stack, I mean that's outside my domain, but that would be more for scalability. And yeah, so I would say if you're scaling it to at the industrial level, then you might need to explore other technology like MERN, MERN.
Yeah, I think that would be like full-blown software engineering. I mean, Facebook is run on MERN also. I was just wondering, did you also have experience with Tableau and Power BI? And what applications do you think it's suitable for? despite its huge price tag?
Right. So actually, I've applied for an academic license for Tableau, but I haven't really used it a lot. Power BI, I haven't used it at all. Yeah, but I know John David has an awesome channel, and he has some tutorials that he has on Udemy as well. I think he has like more than almost 10 courses on Tableau and Power BI. So for those interested in those two, you could check out how to get an analytics job. And John David is the founder of the channel.
And I think, but that limits our options in terms of analyzing the data in terms of machine learning and neural networks, because that only visualizes the data. I'm not sure if I'm wrong, or because last time
I think Power BI you could import Python. So that Python code could probably pre-process the data, and once it's pre-processed to a certain form, then you could visualize the data. But I haven't really tried that yet.
Okay, let's get back to something that you are already expert in. So you wrote a paper on reproducible computational drug discovery, and you argued that it is therefore inevitable that the field of computational drug design would adopt an open approach towards the collection, curation, and sharing of data code. And to me, it sounds very unlikely that big companies who are pouring in billions in drug discovery and research, that they're going to simply open their research data for public to collaborate with, which is kind of sad. But it seems like we are kind of in a stalemate position here. So how do you see that we can foster a collaborative environment for drug discovery and knowledge sharing without actually having these companies help with their own data?
Right. So there are several initiatives, even from big pharma companies. They're called open innovation, whereby they share publicly their otherwise like private data, so that other scientists could have access to. But then this is pretty much limited to diseases like neglected tropical diseases. Where the big pharma really don't really have much interest in, because they're not really making a lot of money out of that. And so, yeah, they are providing some data for free. There are, but then for those that are like more, like for the masses, I think there might be holding back on those kind of data.
How's that working with natural sciences? Because in social science, there's a huge pushback against monopoly of these publishers, where you have to pay like 85 euros for reading one research paper, and people are kind of moving to Arvix and Medium and other publication platforms, but still most of the academic publication happens through these publishers, Nature, Nature Communications, the different variants of that. And I, for one, see it's a very positive trend that people are publishing results. And then we have ResearchGate also. You can simply message one of the authors, and they're more likely to give you their paper. What is the trend in natural sciences?
Yeah, so back in the days, most of the prestigious academic journals are subscription based. And actually, several universities around the world are subscribing to these at a very massive amounts of money. And most are behind a paywall. So meaning that the university needs to make a special agreement with the big publishers in order for their researchers to have access to the data. In recent years, in the past decade, there have been open access publications. Like some notable journal is from PLOS family, Public Library of Science, and other big publishers are also catching up. Like for example, Nature, now it became Nature Springer. They have this what do you call it, scientific report, which is competing against PLOS ONE. And former member of PLOS ONE and also O'Reilly, they partnered together to create this journal called PeerJ, which I also like. It is a subscription-based journal, meaning that you pay a one-time fee, like $500. I got in early, so I paid $300. So I have a lifetime membership, and so I could publish like 5 papers a year for free. Given that I'm like a sole author of the paper, if I have other co-authors have to pay for the membership, and they also have like a per article basis as well. So the thing with all of the open access is that instead of the university paying it and then the reader will have to pay for access to the paper, open access means that the researcher will pay for it, for the publication cost, and then the reader will be able to access it for free. Ways for bypassing that is to share the unformatted paper on arXiv or other similar websites. Like for example, in chemistry, they have the Chem Archive, or there are similar services that are related. They're called preprint. So they have to be unformatted, otherwise it will go against the copyright issues against the publisher, where they formatted your paper. But if you have the unformatted but accepted version, that's perfectly fine. So you could also publish it in traditional journals like from Nature, and then you have another unformatted version shared on arXiv. Or another one would be to request it directly from the authors on ResearchGate, or even email them.
But don't you think it's kind of indirect exclusion of a lot of people around the world are not able to afford the kind of both the publication prices and the subscription prices to be able to read those papers? For example, if you're asking 85 euros for someone in Kenya or in Uganda or even in India, that's not something that they are more than happy to pay, depending on where did they fall in terms of their purchasing power. And I'm just wondering, a lot of hate has been generated even by the authors. For example, I'm pretty sure that if someone sent you a message and asked for a paper that you've written that they cannot afford to buy, you would be more than happy to actually share.
I'm happy to send them over a copy, yeah.
Exactly. And I think most people are like that. But you know what? Why is that these publishing companies don't understand that this model is not sustainable anymore? And I think one of the most successful reactions to that materialized in the form of Sci-Hub and LibGenesis. I'm not sure how much you can talk about that, but how do you see that development?
Yeah, so I mean, they're in pretty much in the dark area. And so, yeah, so those are, yeah, so they're making it more accessible for the general masses, but then it goes against the copyright issues. And so, as you might know, I mean, the websites are changing continuously. Like what worked today might not work tomorrow. So in the long term, I think it's still going to be an issue, because publishers are going to have to make money, and as part of that, they're also going to be charging money. I mean, someone has to pay for their overhead. They have to hire teams. They have to have web servers. Or another one would be, if there is a way to develop a new type of publishing. I mean, we could create a new type of like on the blockchain. Yeah.
Okay.
Instead of a cryptocurrency, we have like a blockchain that pretty much like the review process, the peer review process will occur on the blockchain, and
that's a huge issue for
a
lot of people, because peer review processes, at least in my opinion, very corrupt. And I've got facts to support that also. They're on boards of probably the best journals are only certain people with same ideas. There's no diversity on the board. On top of that, they're mostly only 20% of people are publishing the best result, and I find it unbelievable that 80% of people do not have anything to write about or speak about. And then on top of that, it excludes a lot of people from other emerging research areas. For example, think of an ideal situation where you have, let's say, all of the top journals have 250 spots for publications,
Right.
and they're like a million researchers around the world. So everyone's competing for those 250 positions, which gives them an unfair advantage.
Exactly.
And I'm just wondering. I talk a lot about academic, deterioration, both in terms of quality and quantity. And most of the people that I talked to, I was talking to Luis Serrano. You're probably familiar with him. He also has a YouTube channel, machine learning. Is one of the best quantum computing scientists at Zapata.
Right.
And he was thinking about the same thing, that academics isn't as glorified career as it used to be. What has your experience been?
Yeah. So in academia, the goal, not necessarily my opinion, but the goal is to get published in a high impact factor journal, like for example, Nature or Science. As you mentioned, they have limited spots, and so they have the selective power of accepting only selected articles. But the thing is like this, there has been a study that papers published in high impact factor journals, like for the most part, are not even cited. So more than 80% have 0 citations. And there are only like 20% that are cited. And so the thing is, if papers are not of high, they're not of high interest, so they might not get published there. So it has to have this mass appeal. So the topic has to be like a hot topic, like a trending topic. But then there are some journals emerging like PeerJ where they're not evaluating your work based on the perceived trendiness of your work, but they evaluate your work based on your methodology. Is it scientifically sound? If it is, then they're gonna evaluate and consider it for publication. So a lot of the prior journals that I've previously submitted to, they have this perceived interest. Sometimes they will reject the paper without even sending it for peer review. They'll just take a look and they'll be like, sorry, it's outside the scope of this journal, or it doesn't appeal to their audience. So it's not like scientifically rejecting the work, but based on their audience, will their audience be interested in your work? But PeerJ, I mean, if it's related to life science and if it's scientifically sound, they're definitely going to consider your work. Yeah. So yeah, I have
think this very fact makes academics such a politicized and corrupt industry. And I think of the fact that if you have people who are doing PhDs, why should they actually have the requirement to publish in top journals before they get PhD? Because there are 250 spots, and no matter how many times you try, all those million researchers are not going to publish that. That means that's going to make their durations longer than they normally are. It adds to mental stress. And I've been thinking for a long time for an alternative models to university, and I'm more than happy to explore it with you. What if we only no teachers or no supervisors or no one is able to actually mildly blackmail the students in order to get published? There's a platform online like Open Journals, and everyone's free to publish, just like Medium, and their research. And in the end, there would be people sitting together and see the kind of research they have done and only add to the points which would make research better. So why do we actually have to have grades, to pass people or fail people or exclude them or include them? Instead, help them make their research better and get a degree and be happy. Because I've seen a lot of depression and despondency and hopelessness in PhD students. It's not a very paying career. It doesn't pay very well. I was reading, on Glassdoor, even if you're hiring for a researcher at Stanford, it pays like around 63,000. That's almost like wage worker at some point. And people don't spend a lifetime's work to be able to earn 63,000 when you could be an electrician and work north of 80K. So I was just wondering, do you have over your lifetime formulated some opinions on how academics can be better?
Yeah, I think it's also similar in our case in Thailand as well. So I think it's for the love of science. So the compensation of, obviously, if you have a bachelor's degree, you're obviously going to make more. Like if you spend like 4 years working, and you spend 4 years doing a PhD, by the time 4 years has passed, if you have a bachelor's degree, you're probably going to make much higher salary than if you have a PhD. But I think the thing about pursuing a PhD or a master's is to transform your thoughts process, to be able to solve problems that might be interesting to you, challenging to you. So like personally, it's the thought process, it's the transformation that happens after the PhD. Like the ideas that you will have, like when you view a problem, how will you decide to solve the problem, like in a systematic way? But the thing is, you don't require a PhD to be able to do that. You might also stumble upon being able to solve problems more effectively than a PhD. So, I mean, the thing is not the degree itself, but the exposure of doing a PhD in relation if you're also doing it manually. So the thing is, you might be able to stumble upon the same path. But then in a structured program like a PhD, they'll teach you, you also have to explore by like 3 to 4 years of research in order to solve your hypothesis. Yeah, so in my opinion, I think it's for the love of science that, but then the pay is not.
Yeah, but if you're not incentivizing people through right monetary rewards or even prestige, for example, it's not the end of the world once you have the PhD degree.
Right.
There's always a postdoc.
It's just the beginning.
Yeah, that's just the beginning of another
Yeah.
series of oppression throughout the life that you have to embrace for the love of science. So you say like assistant professor, an associate professor, and a full tenure professor, and then research grants and everything.
Grants. Exactly.
Why would people actually choose a career which has so much pain? Only love of science.
Right. Yeah. So I think, like, for me, it's the ability to explore the possibility to explore things that that might be interesting to you. Like, so, like, for example, you could spend a whole semester just dabbling, coding. Like, the thing is, you might have like a vague hypothesis. So unlike a company or industry that you have to have a clear goal of like making money, in academia sometimes you could do things that don't make money. You could do things that consume money. But the thing is, it's about the creativity, like doing things that seemingly don't make money, but then it might be the basis for discovery of new technologies. So I think the fun part is in that, like being able to, being allowed to kind of like play with your ideas. And yeah, so I think that's
well,
a
lot of people in academia, kind of decide to leave it in their senior ages. For example, you probably are familiar with Fei Li, computer vision course at MIT. She joined Gartner also. And there are also like public
leaving academia for industry, right?
I'm not sure if she kind of left MIT, but she does work for Gartner. That and it's very common. A lot of research institutes at Google and Facebook and Apple, and they hired a lot of academics who are more than happy to go there for once and make some money off of their work also. But it brings me to an interesting question. I mean, what would you pick? Being a world-class, attractive, a genius, or famous for doing something great, if given an option?
I would say doing something fun. Like being a YouTuber is also fun. Yeah, so the middle path. Yeah, so doing something fun and it's impactful.
Okay. I guess that's synonymous to the fact that famous for doing something great. It only happens when you enjoy the process.
Exactly. Right.
you're gonna do great things if you don't enjoy that.
Exactly.
Who do you think is the most influential figure in your field or in general that would you like to emulate?
Yeah. So I mentioned that there was the professor from Uppsala who invited me over to Uppsala to co-apply for the grant and a fellowship. So I think he is one of the role model, Professor Jarl Wickberg, and another is my former PhD supervisor and co-supervisor. So they have taught me to be a scientist, a researcher. And so without both of them, I wouldn't have become a professor. And another is Professor from Lund University, left below, who is who has given me the chance to pursue like computational protein engineering. Yeah.
I think despite chilling cold, Sweden is probably one of the best places if you have the intellectual curiosity for things. I remember my time there. I could go to any class, learn different things in different courses, even if you were not enrolled in that.
Right.
And the environment in general is very encouraging of, minds that are craving that. Finally, you started the YouTube channel at your daughter's request.
Right.
How many children do you have?
How much?
How many children do you have?
Oh, one.
Okay, nice. And what do you see for her in the future? Is she as inquisitive as you? But certainly have great ideas like starting YouTube channels.
Right. So when asked what she wants to become when she grows up, she says she wants to become a game YouTuber.
Okay, like Twitch and
Yeah, like
streaming.
I think YouTube channel, like a game caster.
Does she play any games?
Yeah, she does.
Cool.
Roblox. Yeah.
Oh,
Minecraft.
cool.
Yeah.
Nice. It's been such an honor talking to you, Chanin. I have very few people that I can say that it's a true pleasure and uh, events that I would remember for a long time. Thank you so much for what you're doing on YouTube, inspiring a lot of people to learn data science, machine learning, make an impact in life with their gifts. A lot of people look at you as role model. In my private group, when I announced that I'm going to be having data professor on the channel, everyone was so psyched up.
Cool.
They've benefited from your video. So you might not even know that the impact that you have around the globe, where people know you in unknown places. And it's such an honor to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with us. Would you like to give any message to your viewers and people who look up to you?
Yeah. So, okay, there was a lag in the internet. Yeah. So it's my pleasure, and I thank you for inviting me over on your podcast. And there were a lot of points that were very interesting that we have gone through, and I learned a lot from our discussion. And so I greatly appreciate all of the support from your community and also from the subscriber of this YouTube channel. And it's really been a fun journey for the past 1.5 years. And I'm constantly learning. And right now I'm feeling like I'm a PhD student again, like learning for the first time, the joy of learning a new algorithm. And so that process is, it's kind of like reigniting the fire inside me to learn more. And so the thing is, like, there's so much to learn, but the thing is, like, time is quite limited. And I try to find time in the busy schedule. Like before, there was a lockdown period where we can work from home. And at times, if I can finish up my task early, I could have time for YouTube. But then lately, we're back to work, and so it's been quite a challenge to juggle between academia, like having to publish, having to go through meetings, and also trying to be consistent on YouTube. So yeah, so I still have to figure out how I can be more productive so that I can have more time to make YouTube videos. And yeah, chatting with people like you, I mean, truly inspire me to want to create more videos. And so, yeah, thank you for your invitation here.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure. Everyone who's tuned in, stay tuned for a wonderful guest next week. And you can also join Slack and listen to our podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Thank you so much.